On the morning of June 17, 1944, as the first weak light crept over the western edge of Saipan, Private First Class Charles Merritt crouched in a shallow foxhole west of the village of Charan Kanoa and stared across a field that no longer looked like farmland at all. The cane had been flattened, burned, and churned into the coral soil, and scattered across it lay the blackened shapes of 31 Japanese tanks, frozen where they had died in the darkness. Thin columns of smoke still rose from their engine decks. The metal was so hot it shimmered in the humid air. Merritt was 22 years old, and he had been carrying a bazooka for barely 8 weeks. Most of that time, he had listened to older Marines joke that the weapon was a pipe dream wrapped in Marine Corps optimism, a gadget that looked impressive in manuals but failed when it mattered. It weighed about 15 pounds, fired a rocket barely heavier than a sack of flour, and on paper it could punch through heavy armor at 300 yards. In reality, the sergeant said, it was as unreliable as a dice roll and twice as dangerous to the man firing it. Yet now, as Merritt looked out across the cane field, it was impossible to argue with what lay in front of him. 7 hours earlier, that same field had been alive with engines, shouting men, and the sound of steel tracks grinding forward in the dark. Now it was silent, broken, and still. The attack that had died there had begun shortly after 3 in the morning, when Colonel Takashi Goto unleashed the largest armored assault Japan would ever attempt in the Pacific War. 44 tanks had rolled forward together, Type 97 medium tanks with their squat turrets and 47mm guns, and faster Type 95 light tanks designed to race ahead and punch through infantry lines. Infantry rode on the engine decks and clung to turret sides, rifles slung, bayonets fixed, commanders standing upright in open hatches and shouting orders into the night. Many of the men sang as they advanced, voices carrying across the fields in the darkness, convinced that speed, shock, and courage would smash the American line and drive the Marines back into the sea. Japanese doctrine called it yokusai, honorable annihilation, and it had worked before, again and again, against enemies armed with little more than rifles and grenades. The plan was simple and brutal. Break through the 6th Marines, overrun the division command post, smash the artillery, and collapse the entire American beachhead in one decisive blow. It was a plan built on confidence, experience, and the belief that tanks, once committed, could not be stopped by infantry alone. But the Marines waiting in those foxholes were not the opponents Japan had faced in China. They were young men from farms and factories, yes, but they were armed differently, trained differently, and supported by a web of firepower the Japanese assault had never encountered before. They had 37mm anti-tank guns dug in with overlapping fields of fire. They had pack howitzers already sighted on every likely avenue of approach. They had M4 Sherman tanks standing by behind the lines. Offshore, destroyers waited with star shells loaded, ready to turn night into day at a radio call. And in the foxholes themselves, they had bazookas, carried by 2-man teams who had spent months learning one simple, terrifying skill: wait until the tank passes, stand up, and fire into the thinnest armor at the rear. By the time dawn came, the field looked like a graveyard. Goto's tank regiment had been shattered, and the Japanese would never again mount an armored attack of that scale in the Pacific. Merritt rose from his foxhole and began walking among the wrecks, trying to count how many of those tanks had fallen to weapons so many officers had dismissed as toys. The Japanese had been shocked that Marine bazookas destroyed 31 tanks in a single night. The deeper shock was that the rules of armored warfare in the Pacific had just been rewritten. As the gray, humid dawn spread across the cane fields, Marines from 1st Battalion, 6th Marines moved carefully between the hulks, rifles ready, stepping around twisted steel and dark pools of diesel fuel that reflected the morning light like mirrors. The smell was everywhere: burned rubber, cordite, scorched sugarcane, and something else the younger Marines tried not to name. Merritt passed a Type 97 medium tank that had thrown a track and lay canted at a steep angle, its gun pointing uselessly skyward. The turret hatch was open, and on the rear armor he could see the mark of his own shot, a hole no bigger than a silver dollar, surrounded by steel that had been heated white-hot and then cooled into warped, jagged petals. He had fired that rocket from perhaps 40 yards away, while the tank's machine gun stitched the ground above his foxhole, and Japanese infantry scrambled behind it with bayonets flashing in the starlight. Captain Claude Roland moved up the line, his face streaked with dirt, his ears still ringing from hours of explosions. He stopped beside a group of Marines examining another wreck, a Type 95 light tank that had nearly reached the company command post before a Marine climbed onto its engine deck and dropped a grenade through the hatch. The thin armor, designed for speed, had offered no protection at all. When Major James Donovan arrived with a clipboard and the tired satisfaction of a man who had spent the night wondering if his battalion would still exist at dawn, the count was confirmed. 31 tanks destroyed in and around their sector, with perhaps a dozen more damaged badly enough to limp back north. The numbers told a story neither side had expected when the campaign began. Colonel Goto's 9th Tank Regiment had brought 44 tanks to Saipan, split between Saipan and Guam in the belief that concentrated armor could stop an invasion before it gained momentum. On paper, the Type 97's armor and gun looked respectable by late 1930s standards, and the Type 95 speed had served Japanese forces well in earlier campaigns. In China, these machines had seemed unstoppable. Chinese infantry lacked effective anti-tank weapons, and Japanese doctrine emphasized speed, surprise, and the psychological shock of steel monsters bursting through the dark. Night attacks had been especially effective, with tanks advancing in columns while infantry rode forward to exploit breakthroughs. But Saipan was not China, and the Marines waiting there had arrived with weapons designed specifically to kill tanks. Rocket launchers that could burn through armor. Anti-tank guns that could punch holes clean through steel. Artillery already laid on the ground the tanks would have to cross. Radios that tied every piece together into a single, deadly system. The Japanese planned to use darkness as cover. Instead, they charged into a defense that used darkness as a weapon. Across the battlefield, the wreckage told the story. Tanks hit multiple times as bazooka teams worked methodically, first disabling tracks, then penetrating turret rings or engine compartments. Light tanks that made it within yards of Marine foxholes before a single rocket turned them into blazing wrecks. Infantry meant to protect the armor cut down by machine gun fire before they could even dismount. The Japanese had expected panic, flight, and confusion. They found Marines who waited, aimed, and fired with discipline. As the sun rose higher and the smoke thinned, it became clear that the night of June 16th to 17th marked the end of Japanese armored warfare as a decisive force in the Pacific. The survivors of the 9th Tank Regiment would never again attempt a massed assault. The lesson was brutal and final. The road to that night had begun 2 days earlier, when the invasion itself started. At 0542 on June 15th, the order to land went out, and within minutes tracked amphibious vehicles churned toward Saipan's beaches through heavy seas and strong currents that scattered the assault waves. Battleships and cruisers hammered the ridges with massive shells, but many Japanese guns waited in silence, holding fire until the Marines were committed. When the first vehicles grounded, artillery and mortars opened up, tearing into the landing zones. Commanders were hit, radios went silent, and confusion reigned. And then, before the beachhead was even secure, Japanese tanks appeared, rolling out from concealed positions to fire directly into Marine foxholes. They did not last long. Amphibious vehicles with 75mm guns destroyed them in minutes, establishing a pattern that would repeat again and again. Japanese armor, designed for a different war, was facing weapons built for this one. That first night brought another lesson, when Japanese amphibious tanks and naval infantry attempted a counter-landing under cover of darkness. Destroyers answered with star shells that flooded the beaches with harsh white light. Bazookas and recoilless rifles cut down the attackers almost as soon as they appeared. The battle was over in less than an hour, leaving the shoreline littered with burning wrecks and bodies. Darkness, which Japanese doctrine relied on, had been stripped away by illumination, radios, and coordinated fire. By the time Colonel Goto's tanks began rolling toward Charan Kanoa at 3 in the morning on June 17th, the Marines knew what was coming and how to stop it. B Company, 1st Battalion, 6th Marines lay directly in the path of the attack, their foxholes tied together by shallow trenches. Bazooka teams waited with rockets stacked beside them. Anti-tank guns covered the approaches. Artillery stood ready. When the sound of engines reached the outposts, star shells bloomed overhead, turning the field into a flickering nightmare landscape of light and shadow. Tanks advanced in groups, commanders exposed, infantry clinging to their sides. Then the rockets began to fly. One by one, tanks stopped, burned, or exploded. Bazooka teams fired and displaced, fired again from new positions, working with a precision that came from training and sheer necessity. Artillery ripped apart assembly areas and cut off infantry support. Machine guns poured thousands of rounds into the attackers. Tanks that lost their infantry screen were forced to button up and fight blind, stumbling forward under fire. As dawn approached, the attack dissolved into isolated vehicles wandering or trying to escape. At first light, American tank destroyers and Shermans finished what the night had begun. By 7 o'clock, it was over. The Marines did not stop. 30 minutes later, despite exhaustion and losses, they resumed their advance inland, stepping past smoking hulks that were still too hot to touch. Engineers moved in to clear paths through the wreckage. Prisoners spoke of despair spreading through Japanese lines as news of the tank regiment's destruction traveled. Surviving Japanese tanks were pulled back and dug in as static defenses, their days as mobile weapons over. When a handful attempted another attack days later, American Shermans destroyed them in minutes, suffering no losses at all. The disparity was now absolute. The consequences of that night rippled outward. Japanese doctrine shifted from offense to desperate defense. American confidence in infantry anti-tank weapons soared. Training manuals were rewritten, lessons shared across the Pacific. Bazookas would be used not only against tanks, but against bunkers and caves on islands yet to be fought over. The men who had fired those rockets carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives, a mix of pride, fear, and loss that never quite faded. When Saipan was finally declared secured on July 9th, the island became a base for bombers that could reach Japan itself. But among the many battles fought there, one night in a cane field stood apart. 31 tanks lay silent under the sun, monuments to a moment when courage, training, and a 15-pound weapon in the hands of ordinary Marines proved enough to stop 30-ton machines and change the course of a war.